Racist cop kicks black woman and freezes when her classified clearance outranks every badge present. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Morgan Adams sat quietly on a bench in the park, the soft hum of city life buzzing in the background. The sky was overcast, the clouds swirling with an impending storm, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. She sat with an air of calm authority, her posture upright but relaxed, a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the people around her. Dressed in simple, yet professional attire, she looked every bit like a woman who belonged. But in truth, Morgan was much more than she appeared. Beneath her composed exterior lay a woman with power, a woman who had spent years navigating the world of covert operations and high-stakes investigations. She was a senior agent in the FBI, part of an elite team tasked with exposing corruption and fighting systemic injustice. But none of that was apparent to the onlookers who passed by, nor to the officer who was about to make a life-altering mistake. Officer Rick was on his regular patrol, his eyes scanning the park as he walked. He was the kind of cop who liked to feel in control, the kind who would pick out someone who seemed out of place just to assert his authority. As he spotted Morgan sitting on the bench, a flicker of suspicion crossed his mind. She didn't look like she belonged there. She wasn't dressed like the typical office worker or a person out for a casual stroll. Her presence stood out to him, and without a second thought, he decided to confront her. Striding over to Morgan, he began with an aggressive tone. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air. Morgan looked up at him, her eyes steady and unflinching. She gave a polite but distant smile. "Just enjoying the park," she replied, her voice calm, yet holding an undertone of authority. But Officer Rick wasn't having it. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, his words dripping with judgment. "Where's your ID?" Morgan didn't flinch. She remained seated, her eyes still locked on his, never breaking her composed demeanor. She knew better than to escalate things. She also knew that this officer, like so many others, was quick to judge based on assumptions. "I'm not sure why you're questioning me," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just sitting here." The officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he loomed over her. "I don't take orders from criminals," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. Morgan's expression didn't change. She didn't move, she didn't react. She simply let the tension build, aware that this moment was about to change everything. The air between them crackled with the weight of the unspoken words. Officer Rick stood there, unsure of what to do next, but certain of one thing. Morgan was not the kind of person he could easily intimidate. Yet, little did he know, Morgan was far from ordinary. And before he could make his next move, Morgan slowly stood up, her movements graceful and deliberate. Without saying a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out a badge, and held it up for him to see. The badge gleamed in the dim light of the park, and as Officer Rick's eyes fell on it, his face drained of color. The letters on the badge were unmistakable. FBI. Morgan's gaze remained locked on his, her presence commanding and undeniable. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had just made a massive mistake, and now it was too late. Morgan could feel the weight of the moment as she stood there, holding up her FBI badge for Officer Rick to see. His face turned pale as he stared at the emblem of authority in her hand, the words Federal Bureau of Investigation shining brightly in the dim light. The park around them seemed to quiet, the hum of the city life fading into the background as the tension between them grew thick. She could see the realization dawning on his face, the sudden understanding that he had misjudged her. His eyes flickered from the badge back to her face, his confidence shattered. Morgan remained calm, her expression unchanged, but inside, she was already calculating the next steps. I didn't know," Officer Rick stammered, his voice faltering for the first time. Morgan didn't respond. She didn't need to. His apology wasn't necessary. The damage had been done, and he knew it. Morgan took a small step back, her presence still commanding, as if the power of her position had grown even stronger with each passing second. Officer Rick stood frozen. The initial rush of authority he had felt quickly replaced by uncertainty. He had thought he could control this situation, but now he wasn't so sure. The fear that had been simmering beneath his arrogant exterior began to creep in, and Morgan could see it in the way his hands twitched, unsure of what to do next. She glanced around the park, noticing the few bystanders who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Their eyes were filled with curiosity, some of them looking at her with admiration, while others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what to make of the situation. Morgan took a deep breath, her calm demeanor unwavering. "You're not in control here," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying a quiet force. "You never were." Officer Rick opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet her eyes. Morgan could almost feel the shift in the air, the power dynamic completely reversed. She had been the one in the wrong in his eyes just moments ago, but now she held the upper hand. She knew that it wasn't just the badge that commanded respect. It was the unspoken strength, the authority that came from years of experience and a knowledge that she could handle whatever came her way. After a long pause, Morgan finally spoke again. "You'll be reporting this incident," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Officer Rick nodded silently. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the situation had finally sunk in. Morgan could see his mind racing, his thoughts likely spiraling as he realized the consequences of his actions. She didn't need to say more. The message had been clear. She turned and began walking away, her steps deliberate and sure. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of the few onlookers still trained on her, some in awe, others perhaps in shock. But she didn't care. This was just another day in her line of work, one where justice had been served, even if only in a small way. As Morgan left the park, she knew that the events of the day would not end here. The officer would have to face the consequences of his actions, and the ripple effect would spread far beyond this single interaction. But for now, she had done her part. She had maintained her composure, stood up to injustice, and ensured that the power dynamics would never be the same again. The next time Officer Rick came across someone he thought was an easy target, he would remember this moment, and the woman who had shown him that not everyone could be pushed around. Morgan walked briskly down the sidewalk, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the park. The adrenaline from the earlier encounter still pulsed through her veins, but her face remained impassive. She could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on her back, but she didn't let it sway her. The encounter had been a reminder of how easily power could be misused, and how quickly it could be turned around when you had the right tools at your disposal. The day had started like any other, but it had taken a turn, one that would resonate long after the park was left behind. As she reached her car, she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the soft hum of the vehicle offering a sense of calm. But her mind was still racing. She could picture Officer Rick still standing there in the park, no doubt struggling to make sense of what had just happened. His arrogance had been shattered in an instant, and now he would have to face the consequences. Morgan knew the system would handle it, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was what she had trained for, what she had fought for. It wasn't just about the badge. It was about upholding justice in whatever form that took. She pulled onto the road, heading toward the nearest FBI office. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but she didn't reach for it. She knew what was coming. The call from her superior would be soon, asking for her report, wanting to know every detail. She had prepared for this. This was the part of the job that always followed a moment like the one in the park, a reminder that the fight for justice never truly ended. The drive felt longer than usual, but Morgan wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't trying to outrun anything, but rather, she was settling herself into the quiet rhythm of the next steps. When she arrived at the office, she walked through the doors, greeted by the familiar faces of her colleagues. They didn't know the details of what had happened in the park, but they didn't need to. Morgan was known for her ability to handle high-pressure situations, and her colleagues trusted her judgment. She headed straight for her desk, taking a seat and opening her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, gathering her thoughts before she began typing up her report. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the officer. She wondered how he would process what had just occurred, how his perspective might shift now that he had seen the power of someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. She couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. There would be other moments like this, times when she would be called upon to challenge the system, to right the wrongs. But for now, she would do what she always did, follow the process, write the report, and wait for the next step. She clicked send, finalizing the document and leaning back in her chair. It was done, but it wasn't over. Morgan knew that justice was a long game, and she was ready to play her part. The phone on her desk rang. She answered it without hesitation. "Morgan Adams," she said, her voice calm and steady. On the other end, her superior's voice was unmistakable. "We need you on another case," they said. Morgan didn't flinch. This was her life now, and she was ready for whatever came next. Morgan sat at her desk, the hum of the office filling the background as she read over the report she had just sent. The quiet rhythm of the office, the soft tapping of keyboards, and the faint murmur of conversations were all reminders that life continued, but she knew her day wasn't over. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been a few hours since she filed her report, and her mind kept returning to the events in the park. Officer Rick's stunned face flashed through her mind. He had underestimated her, as so many had done before. But this time, it wasn't just about a moment of confrontation. It was a reminder of the power of standing firm, of not letting others define your place in the world. As Morgan sat there, her phone buzzed, and she instinctively reached for it. The number on the screen was familiar, her superior, the one who had assigned her the new case. She answered the call, her voice calm. "Morgan Adams," she said. "We need you on a case." The voice on the other end responded, the tone urgent but controlled. Morgan's pulse quickened, but she remained composed. She had expected this. The adrenaline, the rush, it was all part of the job. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she replied. She stood, gathering her things, her movements precise and efficient. Her colleagues didn't need to ask what the new case was about. They knew. Morgan was always on the front lines, always ready for whatever came next. She grabbed her jacket, slinging it over her arm, and left the office. The evening air greeted her as she stepped outside, cool but not uncomfortable. The city lights flickered against the dark sky, casting shadows on the streets. She knew where she was going, an old warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't a place most people would venture at night, but Morgan was used to those kinds of places. They didn't intimidate her. They were just part of the landscape. As she drove, her mind turned to the task ahead. The new case was classified, but Morgan didn't need the details to know it would be complex. There were always layers, always deeper connections. That's what made her job both challenging and rewarding. It wasn't just about what happened on the surface. It was about uncovering the truth hidden beneath it all. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. She glanced down quickly, seeing the brief details, a location, a name, and a time. It was all she needed to know. As she approached the warehouse, the atmosphere grew heavier. The buildings here were old, their walls cracked and weathered, a far cry from the clean, modern office buildings she was used to. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. She parked her car a block away, careful not to attract attention. Morgan always preferred to keep a low profile before an operation. She didn't need anyone to know she was there. Stepping out of the car, she adjusted the collar of her jacket and walked toward the warehouse. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence. As she reached the door, she paused, taking a deep breath. She was ready for whatever came next. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the musty scent of the warehouse hitting her immediately. Inside, the dim light barely illuminated the room, but Morgan's eyes quickly adjusted. She knew what to expect here, dark corners, hidden movements, and the ever-present sense of danger. But none of it fazed her. She moved through the space with purpose, her every step calculated. As she approached the center of the warehouse, she spotted the figure she had been looking for, a man, sitting in the shadows, his face partially obscured. Morgan didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The man knew she was there, and he knew what would come next. The tension in the air was palpable as Morgan took a seat across from him, her eyes never leaving his. She was here for information, and she wasn't going to leave until she got it. Morgan sat across from the man in the dimly lit warehouse, the silence between them thick with anticipation. The shadows stretched long on the cracked concrete floor as the only sound was the faint hum of the city in the distance, muffled by the heavy walls of the building. Her eyes never left the man in front of her, whose face was half obscured by the shadows. She could sense his unease, but she didn't let it show. In her line of work, silence was often the most powerful tool. He shifted in his seat, glancing around the room nervously, clearly aware of the weight of the situation. Morgan knew that this was not going to be an easy conversation. She had come here for information, and she wouldn't leave without it. "We both know why I'm here," Morgan said calmly, her voice steady but filled with authority. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between her and the door behind him, as if searching for an escape. But Morgan's presence was commanding, and he knew there was nowhere to run. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice low, almost shaky. Morgan didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "I think you do," she said, her tone unyielding. "You've been involved in something far bigger than you realize, and I'm here to help you understand just how deep it goes." The man swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the chair, knuckles white. He was trying to hide it, but Morgan could see the fear creeping into his posture. She could sense that he was about to crack. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, as if reconsidering. Morgan knew it was time to push. "I'm not here to make threats," she continued, her voice still calm. "I'm here to give you a choice. You can help me uncover the truth, or you can keep hiding behind your lies. Either way, this ends with you either in control of your own fate, or with someone else pulling the strings for you. The question is, how do you want it to play out?" The man's eyes widened as her words sank in. The power dynamics in the room had shifted once again. Morgan wasn't here to intimidate him with force. She was here to make him see the inevitable outcome of his actions. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for the first time, Morgan saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The game was changing. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morgan leaned back in her chair, her expression still neutral. "I want the truth," she said simply. "And I want to know who else is involved in this. I don't care about your excuses or your denials. You've seen enough to know that this situation is bigger than you." The man hesitated, looking away, but Morgan could see the gears turning in his mind. She knew it was only a matter of time before he cracked. The pressure was building, and soon he would be forced to make a decision. She didn't need to say anything more. The silence stretched out between them, heavy with the weight of the choice he had to make. Morgan didn't flinch. She didn't need to say another word. She had given him the space to make his move. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man shifted in his seat once more, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll talk." Morgan didn't smile, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. This was just the beginning. She knew that his confession would lead to more questions, more revelations. But for now, she had what she needed. She stood up, walking toward the door, her steps deliberate and confident. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that things were shifting. The man's voice stopped her just before she reached the door. "You don't understand," he said, his tone suddenly filled with urgency. Morgan turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Tell me everything," she replied, her voice steady. And in that moment, she knew that the truth was about to unravel in ways she hadn't expected. This was just the start of a much bigger story. Morgan stood still, her eyes never leaving the man in the shadows as his confession echoed in the quiet space. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what he was about to reveal. She had known it was only a matter of time before he would crack, But now that it was happening, she couldn't help but feel the tension in her body ease slightly. She took a deep breath, waiting for him to continue. He was finally speaking, finally giving her the pieces she needed to fit this puzzle together. "It's bigger than you think," the man said, his voice now low and tinged with regret. "You're dealing with more than just a few bad officers. There's a network, a system. It's been running for years." Morgan remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to rush him. She had learned long ago that patience was just as powerful a tool as any piece of information. "Who's involved?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying no emotion. The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the door once more, as if he might still be considering running. But then he met her gaze again, his resolve finally breaking. "It's the people at the top," he said. "Politicians, business leaders, cops, even judges. They've been covering their tracks for so long that they think they're untouchable." Morgan processed his words quickly. This was what she had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was still a punch to the gut. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a system that had grown too big to ignore. "Who's the leader?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "It's not one person," he replied, his voice shaking. "It's a collective. A group of people who've been working together for years. They pull the strings from shadows. If you go after them, you'll be making powerful enemies." Morgan took a moment to absorb the information. The man had been right about one thing. This wasn't going to be easy. But nothing ever was. It was the reason she had chosen this life. To dismantle the systems of power that kept people like him in control. She stood up, her expression impassive as she prepared to leave. "You've given me what I need," she said calmly. "Now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your actions. I'll make sure the right people hear your story." The man's face twisted with anxiety, but he nodded. He knew there was no way out now. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking as he stood up, taking a step toward her. "You're not going to leave me here, are you?" Morgan paused at the door, looking back at him. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and firm. "You're not my problem anymore," she said. "But the people you've betrayed will make sure you pay for this." With that, she opened the door and stepped into the night. The warehouse behind her seemed to close off the world as she walked into the cool air. She could feel the weight of the case ahead of her, the lives at stake, the dangerous road she was about to travel. But she was prepared. Morgan always was. She slid into her car, her mind already racing through the next steps, calculating every move, considering every possible outcome. She knew that the network the man had spoken of wasn't going to go down easily, and that meant there would be more obstacles ahead. But Morgan had faced bigger challenges. This wasn't just another case. It was a battle against a deeply rooted system of corruption that had infected the very fabric of the justice system. The fight wasn't going to be over soon, and it wasn't going to be pretty. But Morgan had learned long ago that true justice was never easy. It was a battle of wills, of perseverance. She turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the warehouse, the darkness of the night swallowing her car as she sped off toward her next destination. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to stop until the truth was exposed, no matter how many powerful enemies stood in her way. Morgan drove through the streets, the city lights flashing by as her mind remained focused on the case at hand. The man's confession still echoed in her mind, each word weighing heavier than the last. The corruption he had described, the network that extended far beyond the walls of the police station, had shaken her to the core. It wasn't just about the officer she had known. It was about an entire system that had grown unchecked, a system that had allowed power to be abused for far too long. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the familiar surge of determination settle in her chest. She had a job to do. She wasn't going to let this go. The drive to the next location felt like it took longer than usual. It was almost as if the world around her was slowing down, each passing second building the weight of what was ahead. She knew that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. The more powerful the enemies, the more dangerous the fight. But Morgan had never been the type to shy away from a challenge. When she arrived at the safe house, a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the tension in her body finally started to ease. She had been here before, and she knew what came next. It was time to move forward with the investigation. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by a small team of agents, each one busy preparing for the next phase. They didn't need to know all the details, but they knew enough. The man's confession had given them a lead, and that was all they needed to get started. Morgan quickly briefed the team on what she had learned. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. This was bigger than any one person. The entire system needed to be torn down, but that would take time. "We need to be careful," she said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't just a few corrupt officers. We're dealing with an entire network, and we need to take them down piece by piece." Her team nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. Morgan could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready for whatever came next. After the briefing, she sat alone in her office, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She had a stack of files in front of her, each one containing pieces of the puzzle. She needed to connect the dots to make sure that everything was in place before making the next move. As she flipped through the documents, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her superior, one of the higher-ups in the FBI who had been kept in the loop. The message was brief, but to the point. "We've got word. They're moving. You need to act fast." Morgan's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in the message was unmistakable. She knew what it meant. The network she had been tracking was making a move, and they weren't going to wait around for her to catch up. She stood up, gathering the files and heading for the door. There was no time to waste. The next few hours would be crucial. She needed to be ready for whatever they threw her way. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. But it was more than just a case. It was about making sure that the system was held accountable, that the people who had been hidden behind the shadows of power would finally face justice. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready. Morgan's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of the quiet focus she had settled into. It was a message from her team. "They're moving faster than we thought. We need to act now." The urgency in the text was unmistakable. She knew what that meant. The network was making its move, and every second that passed without action could mean more lives at risk, more people falling prey to the corruption she was trying to expose. Morgan glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, but the time didn't matter anymore. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, her mind racing through the plan. She wasn't just working to take down individuals now. This had grown beyond that. It was a full-blown operation, one that could take months or years to unravel if she wasn't careful. She had to stay ahead. As she stepped into the night air, her mind shifted into gear. The city lights blurred past her as she drove toward the new location. She didn't know exactly what she was walking into, but she had the skills and the knowledge to handle whatever came next. The car hummed along the highway, and as it cut through the empty streets, Morgan could feel the weight of the task at hand settling in. Every turn, every stoplight felt like a step closer to something huge. She couldn't shake the feeling that this case was unlike any other she had handled before. It was dangerous. There were too many moving parts, too many powerful people at play. But that didn't faze her. She had dealt with danger before, and she knew how to navigate through the chaos. When she arrived at the building, a nondescript office complex on the outskirts of the city, Morgan immediately parked in the lot. Her eyes scanned the area. It was quiet, too quiet. She knew something wasn't right. As she stepped out of the car, her senses went on high alert. The building seemed abandoned, the lights dim and flickering. She approached the entrance carefully, her hand resting lightly on the gun at her side, not because she expected to use it, but because she needed to be ready for whatever might come. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the smell of old wood and stale air greeting her. Morgan moved silently, listening for any sign of movement. She wasn't alone in this building, that much was clear. Her team was just behind her, keeping their distance so as not to tip off anyone who might be watching. They had to move quickly and with precision. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. The halls were long, the walls lined with old files and dusty shelves. Morgan's footsteps echoed as she made her way through the building, following the faint sound of voices up ahead. She slowed as she approached the room where the voices seemed to originate. There was a small window in the door, and she could just make out the figures inside. She could see the outline of a man talking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. The tension in the air was thick. She knew she was about to step into something big. She signaled to her team, and they positioned themselves strategically around the building. It was time to move. Morgan took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was coming next. As she opened the door, the voices stopped immediately. All eyes turned toward her, and the room went silent. Morgan didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to take control of the situation. "I'm not leaving until you tell me everything," Morgan said, her voice low but filled with authority. The man who had been speaking took a step back, his eyes wide. Morgan could see the recognition in his gaze. He knew who she was. He also knew that the game had changed. The pieces were moving, and there was no going back now. Morgan stood tall in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room as the people inside slowly shifted their focus to her. The tension was thick, the kind that you could feel in the pit of your stomach, and yet Morgan remained calm, unshaken. She had prepared for moments like this. She had trained for this. The man she had been tracking, the one responsible for so many of the tangled threads she had been following, was finally in front of her. His eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and recognition, and Morgan could tell he knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. He had thought he was untouchable. That thought had been shattered the moment she stepped into this room. "You've been running from a truth for a long time," Morgan said, her voice unwavering. "But you can't run anymore." There was a pause, the air still hanging heavy between them. The man opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if weighing his options. Morgan didn't give him the time to consider his next words. She took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You can make this easier on yourself," she continued. "I have the evidence. I know everything. You can either tell me what I need to know, or you can face the consequences." The man's face turned pale, and Morgan could see the cracks in his tough exterior begin to show. For a moment, he seemed to struggle internally, and then, finally, he spoke. "I don't have a choice, do I?" His voice was low, almost resigned. Morgan didn't answer. She didn't need to. His surrender was all but guaranteed. "I'll talk," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you have to promise me protection." Morgan nodded, though she knew she couldn't make any promises. She was here to uncover the truth, not to negotiate. "I can't promise protection," she said, "but I can promise that if you cooperate, the system will handle it." His shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "It's bigger than you think," he whispered. "There's no way to stop it now. They have too much power." Morgan's mind raced as she processed his words. She had known the network was deep, but hearing him confirm, it was like watching the final piece of a puzzle fall into place. This wasn't just a case about exposing a few corrupt individuals. It was a fight to bring down an entire system, one that had been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Tell me everything," she demanded. The man shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching at his sides. "I never meant for it to go this far," he began. "It started with a few favors, a few deals, and then it just snowballed. People at the top, they control everything. Politicians, law enforcement, business leaders, they've all been in on it. They've been pulling the strings for years, making sure that no one questions their authority." Morgan listened closely, her mind piecing together the fragments of information he was feeding her. This was it. This was the key to bringing everything to the surface. "Who else is involved?" she asked, her voice steady. "Give me names." He hesitated, but only for a moment. "It's not just the ones you think. There are people you wouldn't believe, high-ranking officials, even judges. They've been covering for each other, making sure no one gets caught." Morgan's eyes narrowed as she processed the enormity of what he was saying. The walls of power were high, but they weren't impenetrable. "Not anymore." "What do you want me to do now?" the man asked, his voice trembling. Morgan stood still, her gaze unwavering. "Finish what you started," she said, her tone final. "Tell me everything, and we'll make sure this ends. We'll expose them all." He nodded slowly, defeated. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of his voice as he began to speak, the names spilling out one by one. With each word, Morgan could feel the weight of the case shifting. This was it, the beginning of the end.